The elk came down from the high country on the second day of November in the year 1887, and the old-timers who bothered to look up from their coffee cups noticed something wrong in the way the animals moved. The dawn temperature had already fallen to 12 degrees and continued its descent with the steady inevitability of a body lowering into a grave. 847 souls clung to the mountainside that was Quartz Hill, Colorado, a town that had given up its silver 2 years prior and now survived on stubbornness and the fading memory of wealth. The elk streamed down from the peaks in desperate waves, their eyes rolling white with a fear that had no name humans could pronounce, and they moved through the valley below town like a brown river fleeing some unseen flood. At the general store, Caleb Holbrook had just finished painting the sign for his pre-winter sale, and the bright red letters promised savings on canned goods and lamp oil. Nobody wanted to think about what the animals knew. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that the creatures who had lived in these mountains for 10,000 years might understand something that men with ledgers and ambitions could not. The temperature would drop another 17 degrees before nightfall. Rosalind Ironwood had arrived in Quartz Hill in the spring of 1886, when the snow still patched the higher meadows and the aspens were just beginning to think about budding. She was 34 years old, a widow whose black dress had faded to charcoal from the trail dust of 700 miles. Her wagon carried canning supplies instead of furniture, glass jars wrapped in straw instead of china plates, and her hands bore the calluses of a woman who had learned early that survival required more than hope. The dun mare who pulled her wagon was named Whisper, for the soft sound she made when Rosalind approached her in the mornings, and her coat was the color of autumn wheat touched by shadow. William had died of fever on the trail west, somewhere between the Missouri and the Colorado border, in a stretch of prairie where the grass grew tall enough to hide a standing man. The fever came fast and burned hot, and Rosalind had held his hand through 3 nights of delirium before his body finally surrendered to what his mind had already fled. She buried him in that tall grass, marking the grave with a cairn of stones that the prairie would eventually swallow, and she spoke the words her grandmother had spoken over too many graves in the old country. Then she climbed back onto the wagon seat, took up the reins, and continued west. Her grandmother had been a woman named Bronwyn Perry, who came from the mining valleys of Merthyr Tydfil in Wales, and who had survived the hungry 40s when the iron furnaces went cold and the wages stopped and the bodies piled in the chapel yards. Bronwyn had lived because she understood that famine announced itself months before it arrived, in the behavior of animals and the color of caterpillars and the way the wind carried the smell of dying things. She preserved everything that could be preserved, smoked everything that could be smoked, and when the starving time came, she fed herself and 3 orphaned nieces from shelves she had filled when others were still dancing at harvest festivals. Bronwyn died when Rosalind was 19, her heart simply stopping one winter morning as she sat in her chair by the fire. But before she died, she had placed her hands on Rosalind's hands and said the words that Rosalind still heard in dreams. "The mountains told me, and I told you, and now we both know." The knowledge was an inheritance more valuable than gold, and Rosalind carried it west in her blood and her bones. She claimed 40 acres on the north-facing slope, where the ground stayed cool even in high summer, land that Caleb Holbrook examined from behind his general store counter with the expression of a man watching someone make a terrible mistake. The store smelled of tobacco and leather and the particular staleness of goods that had sat too long on shelves. "He fit only for rattlesnakes and regret," Holbrook announced to the 3 other customers present, loud enough for Rosalind to hear. A north-facing slope at this altitude. The woman will be buried under snow 6 months a year and baked by reflected heat the other 6. Rosalind had simply signed the deed, paid her $12 to the land office, and asked where she might purchase salt in quantity. She began digging in May, when the soil had finally thawed enough to accept a shovel. The hillside rose behind her claim like the hunched shoulder of a sleeping giant, and she chose a spot where the natural drainage would carry water away from the entrance, and where the earth was dense with clay that would hold its shape. Her grandmother had described the root cellars and storage caves of the Welsh mining communities, structures carved into mountainsides where the temperature stayed constant year-round, and food could be preserved for months without spoiling. Rosalind worked alone, rising before dawn and digging until her arms trembled and her back screamed for mercy, then resting only long enough to feed Whisper and eat a cold supper before sleeping the dreamless sleep of exhaustion. The hole grew deeper. 6 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet. She reinforced the walls with stones gathered from the creek bed, fitting them together without mortar in the old way her grandmother had described, each stone chosen for its shape and placed to lock against its neighbors. She built a ventilation system using salvaged stovepipe, angling the intake low and the exhaust high so that air would circulate naturally, and she lined the floor with flagstones to keep the damp from rising. The entrance she framed with heavy timbers, cutting each one herself from deadfall pines and dragging them down the slope with Whisper's patient help. By August, the cellar extended 30 feet deep into the hillside, 12 feet wide at its broadest point, with shelving carved directly into the stone walls and ceiling hooks for hanging meat. The temperature inside held steady at 42 degrees, regardless of whether the sun blazed outside or frost crept across the meadows. It was a cathedral built for preservation, a temple dedicated to survival, and Rosalind stood in its cool darkness and felt her grandmother's approval settling over her like a blessing. She spent $67 on glass jars at the general store, counting out the coins while Caleb Holbrook made a show of examining each one for authenticity. Another $40 went to salt and vinegar, and she purchased enough cheesecloth to strain a river. All of August she worked, smoking venison over slow fires of applewood she had hauled from a dying orchard 20 miles distant, pickling everything that grew in her small garden and in the meadows around her claim. Cabbages went into barrels with salt and caraway seeds. Beans filled jars packed with brine. Wild onions, carrots pulled from her patch, the small sour apples that grew along the creek, all of it processed according to methods Bronwyn had taught her when she was too young to understand why such knowledge mattered. By October, 400 jars stood gleaming on the stone shelves like stained glass in a church, catching what little light reached the back of the cellar and holding it in shades of amber and ruby and deep forest green. Smoked venison hung from the ceiling hooks, dark and fragrant, enough protein to sustain 20 people through months of hunger. Barrels of pickled cabbage and beans lined the walls, their contents sealed against the air, waiting. She had preserved enough food to feed 20 people for 3 months. Whisper stood in her small stable at the front of the property, watching Rosalind emerge from the cellar each evening with the patient curiosity of an animal who has learned to trust one human absolutely. Rosalind would rest her forehead against the mare's warm neck and whisper the day's progress into her mane, and Whisper would blow softly and accept the confession without judgment. The people of Quartz Hill noticed the digging. They noticed the jars accumulating on shelves in the general store's back room, waiting for pickup. They noticed the widow who lived alone on worthless land and who seemed to be preparing for something none of them could name. They noticed, and they began to talk. The talk began in earnest on the first Sunday of September, when Rosalind appeared at the general store to purchase another 20 pounds of salt, and Caleb Holbrook decided that silence was no longer sufficient commentary on her activities. "The jar lady returns," he announced from behind his counter, his voice carrying to every corner of the establishment where a half-dozen customers had paused in their browsing to observe. "Tell me, Mrs. Ironwood, are you planning to pickle the entire territory, or just the parts that do not run away fast enough?" Rosalind counted out her coins without looking up. 20 pounds of salt, Mr. Holbrook, And another bolt of cheesecloth if you have it. Oh, I have it. Holbrook made a show of retrieving the items with exaggerated slowness, allowing his audience time to appreciate his performance. Though I confess myself curious about what use a widow woman has for so much preserving equipment. Building yourself a tomb out there, are you? A nice cool place for your dead husband's ghost to live? A woman in a blue bonnet laughed, then covered her mouth with her hand when Rosalind turned to look at her. The woman's cheeks flushed, but she did not apologize. My husband rests in Missouri, Rosalind said quietly. What I build for the living. She paid for her purchases, loaded them into Whisper's saddlebags, and rode back up the north-facing slope without speaking another word. But behind her the conversation continued, and by evening half the town had heard Caleb Holbrook's assessment of the strange widow on the worthless land. The following week she purchased 50 feet of rope, 6 additional stovepipe sections, and a small keg of lard for waterproofing leather. The rope cost her $3, the stovepipe another $4.50, and the lard came to 75 cents. She recorded each purchase in the small leather notebook she kept in her apron pocket, the same notebook where her grandmother had once recorded the supplies that would see them through the hungry winters of Wales. The pages before her own entries were filled with Bronwyn's careful handwriting, faded now but still legible, and sometimes Rosalind would read them by candlelight, letting her grandmother's voice fill the silence of her cabin. She expanded the ventilation system first, running additional pipe through carefully calculated angles to ensure air would continue flowing, even if snow blocked the primary intake. The mathematics of ventilation were precise. 40 people breathing in an enclosed space would consume the available oxygen within hours if fresh air could not circulate. She did not know why she had calculated for 40 people when she had provisions enough for only 20. The number had simply felt correct, as certain in her chest as the knowledge that winter was coming early and would not be gentle. The secondary ventilation shaft emerged 50 feet upslope from the entrance, disguised beneath a cairn of stones that would prevent snow from sealing it completely. She covered the opening with wire mesh purchased at considerable expense from a hardware supplier in Denver, awaiting the delivery for 3 weeks before it finally arrived on the supply wagon. The mesh cost her $8, more than she had spent on food for herself in 2 months, but it would keep animals from nesting in the shaft and blocking the airflow when she needed it most. Inside the cellar, she constructed sleeping platforms along the walls, simple frames of rough lumber topped with straw-stuffed pallets covered in oilcloth. The lumber came from a failed cabin 3 miles down the valley, purchased from its owner for $6 and hauled up the slope board by board on Whisper's patient back. The oilcloth cost another $12, and the straw she gathered herself from the meadows before the first frost could flatten it. By the end of September, the cellar could accommodate 36 people lying side by side on the platforms, with additional floor space for another dozen if necessary. She did not know why she kept expanding the capacity. She knew only that her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory, and the voice said that when the hungry time came, there would always be more mouths than expected. Martha Holbrook organized the quilting circle on the second Tuesday of each month, and the women of Quartz Hill gathered in the back room of the general store to stitch and gossip and reinforce the invisible boundaries of respectable society. Rosalind had attempted to attend the September meeting, arriving with her own fabric scraps and needles, only to find that every seat at the quilting frame was already occupied, and that the women had begun their work 30 minutes earlier than the announced time. "Oh, Mrs. Ironwood," Martha said, her smile as thin and cold as creek ice. "I'm so sorry. We thought you would be too busy with your, what do we call it, your canning activities." The other women laughed, and Rosalind noted how their eyes slid away from hers, how they would not meet her gaze directly. "We did not think to send word of the time change." Rosalind stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the circle of bent heads and busy needles, and she understood that no word would ever be sent, no matter how many times the schedule changed. "I wish you well with your quilting," she said, and she walked back out into the September sunshine with her fabric scraps still bundled under her arm. The exclusion spread like a slow disease through the social fabric of Quartz Hill. When Rosalind entered the general store, conversations paused and then continued in whispers after she passed. When she attended Sunday services at the small white church, the pew where she sat remained empty on either side, as though she carried some invisible contagion that respectable people instinctively avoided. When she nodded greeting to women she passed on the street, they returned her acknowledgement with tight smiles that vanished the moment she looked away. The Hendricks boy threw a stone at her wagon in early October as she drove through town to purchase additional supplies. The stone struck the sideboard with a sharp crack, and the boy ran laughing to where his friends waited behind the livery stable. Rosalind reined Whisper to a halt and looked at the small dent the stone had left in the weathered wood, and then she looked at the faces watching from doorways and windows along the main street. No one moved to reprimand the boy. No one even pretended to have seen what had happened. That evening, she stood in the stable with her arms wrapped around Whisper's neck, breathing in the warm animal smell that had become more familiar to her than any human presence. "Let them fill their mouths with laughter," she said quietly, her voice muffled against the mare's mane. "It costs me nothing and teaches them everything." Whisper blew softly and turned her head to lip at Rosalind's sleeve, and for a moment the world contracted to this small, warm space where nothing existed except the patient love of a creature who did not care about quilting circles or social standing, or the opinions of storekeepers who had never known hunger. The pine squirrels had been caching acorns since August, and Rosalind had watched them with growing unease as the weeks passed. Normal years, the squirrels gathered steadily but without urgency, filling their stores at a pace that suggested confidence in the coming winter's duration. This year, they worked with frantic desperation, running back and forth across the meadows until their small bodies trembled with exhaustion, cramming their caches so full that acorns spilled from the hiding places and rolled down the slope like tiny harbingers. She had counted the trips one morning and calculated that each squirrel was storing 3 times its usual winter supply. The geese had already gone south. Rosalind had seen them flying over in late August, their V formations cutting across a sky that should not have witnessed their passage for another 6 weeks. She had stood in her doorway and watched them disappear over the southern peaks, and she had felt the cold settle into her bones like a premonition. The birds knew. The squirrels knew. Even the beaver in the creek below her property knew, building their dam higher than any dam she had seen in her years of watching, creating a pond deep enough to survive an ice sheet of unusual thickness. The woolly bear caterpillars were solid black. She found the first one on the first day of October, crawling across the path that led to her cellar entrance. She picked it up carefully, letting it walk across her palm while she examined its coloring. The woolly bears she had known in her childhood always displayed a band of brown around their midsections, and her grandmother had taught her to read the width of that band as a prediction of the coming winter's severity. Wide brown band meant mild winter. Narrow brown band meant hard winter. No brown band at all meant something her grandmother had seen only once, in the autumn before the worst winter of the Hungry 40s. Rosalind found 6 more caterpillars over the following week. Every one of them was solid black from end to end. She mentioned the caterpillars at the general store when she purchased her final supplies, a casual comment offered to no one in particular as she waited for Caleb Holbrook to tally her purchases. "The woolly bears have no brown," she said, "and the geese went south 6 weeks early. I would suggest that people consider increasing their winter stores." The store fell silent for a moment, and then Caleb Holbrook laughed, a loud barking sound that held no humor. "The jar lady thinks she can read the future in bug fur," he announced to his customers. "What next, Mrs. Ironwood? Will you tell our fortunes by examining chicken entrails? Will you predict the weather by consulting the phases of the moon?" He shook his head with exaggerated pity. Some of us prefer to rely on the Farmer's Almanac, which predicts a mild and uneventful winter for the Colorado Territory. But please, do not let science and reason interrupt your, what shall we call them, your folk superstitions. The other customers laughed, and Rosalind gathered her purchases and left without responding. She had said what there was to say. The choice to listen or not was theirs. That night, she stood once more in Whisper's stable, the October darkness pressing against the small building like a living weight. The mare's breath plumed white in the cold air, visible even in the dim light that seeped through the gaps in the boards. "They will come," Rosalind whispered, her hands moving slowly across Whisper's neck. "When the world turns white and hungry, they will remember the woman they laughed at, and they will come to her door asking for what they mocked her for having." She pressed her forehead against the mare's warm shoulder. "And I will let them in, old friend. Not because they deserve mercy, but because my grandmother would have let them in, and I am my grandmother's inheritance, and I will not dishonor what she gave me." Whisper stood perfectly still, as though understanding the weight of the words being spoken into her mane. "The storm is coming." Rosalind closed her eyes. "I cannot tell you when, but I can tell you it will be worse than anyone believes. The mountains told me, and I am telling you, and now we both know." She paused, her breath shuddering. "I only pray that the food is enough, that the shelter is enough, that I am enough." The mare turned her head and pressed her soft nose against Rosalind's cheek, and the touch was the only comfort available in a world that had chosen to look away. The last week of October brought a false spring that fooled everyone except Rosalind and the animals who had already fled. Temperatures rose into the 50s, the sun shone with convincing warmth, and the people of Quartz Hill congratulated themselves on the mild autumn and the easy winter the almanac had promised. Caleb Holbrook announced a pre-winter sale, painting his sign in bright red letters that promised savings on preserved goods and lamp oil. Martha Holbrook organized a harvest dance at the church hall. Children played in the streets until well past supper time, reluctant to waste the unexpected gift of warmth. Rosalind sealed her final jars and arranged them on the shelves with the careful attention of a woman who understood that these jars might be the difference between life and death for people who had laughed at their creation. 400 vessels of preserved food stood in ordered rows, their contents gleaming like promises in the cool darkness of the cellar. Smoked venison hung from every available hook, the meat dark and fragrant with apple smoke. The barrels of pickled vegetables lined the walls, their lids sealed with wax and marked with the dates of their preparation. She had done everything she could do. On the first day of November, the elk began to move. Rosalind was drawing water from the creek when she saw them, a river of brown bodies flowing down from the high country with a speed that spoke of desperate fear. She had lived in the mountains long enough to know the normal patterns of elk migration, the gradual drifting to lower elevations that accompanied the first snows of autumn. This was not migration. This was flight. The animals poured through the valley below her property in numbers she could not count, their hooves churning the half-frozen ground into mud, their eyes rolling white with terror at something they could sense and she could only imagine. The second day of November dawned at 12 degrees, and the temperature was still falling when the sun cleared the eastern peaks. 847 souls stirred in their beds, complained about the cold, and went about their business without noticing that the elk had vanished from the valley, that the air held a heaviness that pressed against the lungs, that the sky to the northwest had taken on a color that belonged to no honest weather. Rosalind stood at the entrance to her cellar and felt her grandmother's voice rising in her blood. "The storm is coming," she said to Whisper, who stood beside her with ears pricked forward, listening to something only animals could hear. "God help us all. It is coming. The storm announced itself on the morning of November 7th with a silence so complete that Rosalind woke before dawn, startled by the absence of sound. No wind stirred the pines. No birds called from the bare branches of the aspens. Even Whisper stood motionless in her stall, her ears flat against her skull, her body trembling with a fear that had no name. Rosalind dressed in the darkness, pulling on every layer she owned, and stepped outside to face what was coming. The sky to the northwest had turned the color of a bruise, purple and green and sickly yellow, and it stretched from horizon to horizon like a living thing preparing to swallow the world. The temperature had fallen to 4 degrees during the night, and the air itself seemed to have thickened, pressing against her lungs with each breath. She could feel the storm's approach in her bones, in the way her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper urgently from somewhere deep in her memory. Get inside. Get underground. It comes. She led Whisper into the cellar, down the sloping entrance that she had built wide enough for just this purpose. The mare balked at the darkness, but Rosalind spoke to her in the low Welsh words her grandmother had used to calm frightened animals, and eventually Whisper allowed herself to be guided into the cool depths of the earth. Rosalind tied her to a post near the secondary ventilation shaft, where fresh air would keep her comfortable, and spread a thick layer of straw beneath her hooves. The first flakes began to fall at 9 in the morning, gentle and deceptive, drifting down from that terrible sky like the opening notes of a symphony that would build to a crescendo of destruction. By noon, the snow was falling so heavily that Rosalind could not see the tree line 50 yards from her property. By 3 in the afternoon, the wind arrived. It came screaming down from the peaks like a beast unleashed from some frozen hell, driving the snow horizontally through the air with a force that stripped bark from trees and tore shingles from roofs. The temperature plummeted to 15 degrees below zero, then 20, then 25. The storm wrapped itself around Quartz Hill like a predator closing its jaws on prey, and it did not let go. The first night was the worst, because it was the night of false hope. The people of Quartz Hill huddled in their homes, feeding their stoves, telling themselves and their children that the storm would pass by morning. They had seen bad weather before. They had survived difficult winters. This was Colorado, and Coloradans were made of stern stuff. But this storm was not weather. This storm was judgment. By the second day, the snow had risen to 4 feet and was still falling. The wind had not stopped for a single moment, and the cold had deepened to 31 degrees below zero, a temperature at which exposed flesh froze in minutes, and even the most determined optimist began to understand that something unprecedented was happening. The livery stable collapsed at 2 in the morning of November 8th, the weight of accumulated snow crushing its roof like a man crushing an eggshell. The horses screamed as they died, and their screams carried through the howling wind to every home in Quartz Hill, a symphony of terror that no one who heard it would ever forget. Thomas Mercer was the first to die. He was 73 years old, a widower who had come to Quartz Hill in the early days of the Silver Rush and stayed when everyone with sense had left. His cabin stood on the eastern edge of town, exposed to the full fury of the wind, and his stovepipe failed sometime during the second night. The cold crept into his home like a thief, stealing the warmth from his blood while he slept. When his neighbor finally reached him on the 4th day, Thomas was sitting in his chair by the dead stove, frozen solid, his hands still wrapped around the coffee cup he had been holding when the cold took him. The coffee had frozen into a brown disk of ice. The Garrett twins died on the 3rd night. They were 6 years old, a boy and a girl with matching red hair and matching freckles and matching gaps where their front teeth had recently fallen out. Their mother had done everything right, had kept the stove burning, had wrapped them in every blanket she owned, had held them against her body to share her warmth. But the roof of their cabin had been weakened by the weight of the snow, and when it collapsed at 4 in the morning, the cold poured in like floodwater. She held her children as they shivered, as their lips turned blue, as their small bodies grew still in her arms. She held them for 6 hours before the sun rose, though there was no sun to be seen through the endless curtain of white, and she did not stop holding them until neighbors broke through the snow to find her. The Garrett widow walked to Rosalind's cellar on the 5th day, carrying her surviving infant against her chest. She had wrapped the baby in every piece of cloth she could find, had covered them both with a canvas tarp she had pulled from the wreckage of her cabin, and she had walked through chest-deep snow for 300 yards, following the faint memory of where the strange woman with the underground shelter had built her home. The wind tried to knock her down. The cold tried to stop her heart. But she had watched 2 of her children die, and she would not watch the 3rd one follow them into the darkness. Rosalind saw her coming through the swirling snow, a dark shape struggling against the white, and she was waiting at the entrance to the cellar with blankets and warm broth before the widow reached the door. "Come inside," she said. Those were the only words she spoke. She did not ask questions. She did not demand explanations. She simply took the widow by the arm and guided her down into the warmth of the earth, into the 42-degree sanctuary that smelled of smoked meat and pickled vegetables and survival. The widow collapsed onto one of the sleeping platforms, her body shaking so violently that she could not hold the cup of broth Rosalind pressed into her hands. Rosalind held it for her, tilting it gently to her lips, letting the warm liquid restore some measure of life to the frozen woman. "My children," the widow said when she could finally speak. "My twins. They are dead." "I know," Rosalind said. "I am sorry." "How do you know?" The widow's voice cracked on the question, and Rosalind understood that she was not asking about the twins specifically, but about everything, about the storm, about the cellar, about the 400 jars of preserved food that stood in ordered rows along the stone walls. "My grandmother knew," Rosalind said, "and she told me. And now I am telling you." The widow wept then, great heaving sobs that echoed off the stone walls, and Rosalind held her as she cried, asking nothing, offering nothing, except the simple presence of another human being who understood that grief required no explanation. The storm continued. On the 6th day, Caleb Holbrook's general store lost its entire front wall. The wind had been working at it for days, finding the weakness in the boards, the gaps where the nails had not been driven deep enough, and when it finally tore free, it took everything with it. The shelves that Caleb had stocked with such pride, the preserved goods he had been selling at premium prices, the sacks of flour and sugar and salt that represented his entire investment in the coming winter, all of it was swept out into the snow and buried within minutes. Caleb stood in the wreckage of his store, watching his livelihood disappear beneath the white, and for the first time in his adult life, he had nothing clever to say. The 7th day brought the coldest temperature yet, 34 degrees below zero, a number so extreme that it seemed to belong to some other world, some frozen planet where human beings were never meant to survive. The snow had finally stopped falling, but the wind had not relented, and it sculpted the accumulated precipitation into drifts that reached the 2nd-story windows of the tallest buildings. People who had been trapped in their homes for nearly a week began to understand that they might not survive another week. The food was running out. The fuel was running out. The hope was running out. They came to Rosalind's cellar in ones and twos at first, following the path that the Garrett widow had blazed through the snow. They came with shame on their faces and hunger in their bellies, and they came because they had no other choice. Rosalind welcomed them all. She organized the underground space with the same careful attention she had given to preserving her food, assigning sleeping platforms in shifts, rationing the provisions according to need, teaching everyone who would listen how to make what they had last as long as possible. She showed them how to check the smoked meat for signs of spoilage, how to dilute the pickled vegetables with water to stretch them further, how to rotate through the jars so that nothing went to waste. My grandmother would have you stir the brine, she told a group of women who had gathered around one of the barrels of pickled cabbage. She said it keeps the vegetables from settling, keeps the preservation even throughout the barrel. She learned that in Wales, when she was younger than any of you. The women listened. They had laughed at her just weeks before, had excluded her from their quilting circle, had whispered about her behind their hands at church. Now they listened as though their lives depended on what she was saying, because their lives did depend on it. On the 8th day, 40 people were living in Rosalind's cellar. They slept in shifts on the platform she had built, curled together for warmth despite the steady 42 degrees that the earth provided. They ate her preserved food, drank water from the barrel she had filled before the storm, breathed air that flowed through the ventilation system her grandmother had described from the old Welsh mining communities. They lived because she had prepared for their living, because she had spent the summer building a shelter that they had called a gopher hole, because she had ignored their mockery and trusted her grandmother's voice. The antagonist who had led that mockery was among them. Caleb Holbrook had come on the 7th day, leading his wife Martha and their 3 children through the snow. He had said nothing when Rosalind opened the entrance to the cellar. He had said nothing when she showed them to an empty platform. He had said nothing when she handed him a cup of warm broth made from bones she had been saving for just such a purpose. He said nothing for 2 full days, sitting in the corner of the cellar with his family watching Rosalind distribute food and teach preservation and care for 40 people who had done nothing to deserve her care. On the 9th day, the storm finally broke. The wind died sometime before dawn, and when Rosalind climbed to the entrance of the cellar, she saw a world transformed. The snow lay 6 feet deep across the landscape, sculpted into fantastic shapes by wind that had blown for 9 days without pause. The sky was clear for the first time since November 6th, and the sun rose over the eastern peaks with a brilliance that seemed almost cruel after so much darkness. Quartz Hill had survived. Not all of it, not everyone, but the core of the community remained. 23 people had died, frozen in their homes or crushed beneath collapsed roofs or simply worn out by the cold and the fear and the endless howling of the wind. But 824 souls still drew breath, and 40 of them owed that breath to a woman they had called the Jar Lady. Rosalind stood at the entrance to her cellar watching the survivors begin to emerge from their refuges, and she felt her grandmother's presence beside her like a warm hand on her shoulder. "We did it," she whispered. "Grandmother, we did it." The sun climbed higher and the snow began to glitter, and somewhere in the distance an elk called to its herd. The animals were coming back. The mountains were remembering how to live. But Rosalind knew that the true reckoning had not yet begun. The storm had broken bodies and buildings. What came next would break something else entirely. Pride, certainty, the comfortable assumption that mockery carried no cost. She returned to her cellar, where 40 people waited for guidance, and she began to plan for what would come when the snow finally melted. The days that followed the storm's breaking were days of labor and grief, and the slow, painful work of survival. Rosalind organized the 40 people in her cellar into work parties, sending the strongest men to dig paths through the 6-foot drifts, while the women and older children helped distribute food and tend to those too weak to work. The contrast between her modest underground shelter and the wreckage of Quartz Hill could not have been more stark. Caleb Holbrook's general store stood open to the sky, its front wall scattered across the snow in splinters, its shelves empty, its carefully curated inventory buried beneath white drifts that would not melt for months. The man who had mocked her preparations now ate from her jars, slept on her platforms, breathed air that flowed through ventilation systems he had called unnecessary. She taught as she shared. This was her grandmother's way, and it was her way, and she would not hoard knowledge any more than she would hoard food when people were hungry. The smoking process, she explained to a group that included Martha Holbrook and 3 other women from the quilting circle, requires patience above all else. The fire must be low, barely more than embers. Apple wood is best, but cherry or hickory will serve. The meat must hang far enough from the heat that it dries slowly, over days, not hours. If you rush it, the outside will harden before the inside has given up its moisture, and the meat will spoil from within. The women listened with an attention they had never shown her before. Martha Holbrook, who had organized her exclusion from their sewing gatherings, now sat at her feet like a student before a master and asked questions about salt ratios and brine temperatures. Rosalind answered them all. She did not remind Martha of the quilting circle. She did not mention the whispered conversations that had stopped whenever she entered the general store. She simply taught, because teaching was what her grandmother had done, and because knowledge shared was knowledge that might save lives when the next storm came. And there would be a next storm. There always was. The survivor count became clear over the following week. 824 souls remained of the 847 who had greeted November. 23 had died. Thomas Mercer, the old-timer who had watched the elk with knowing eyes, frozen in his bedroom when his stovepipe failed. The Garrett twins, crushed beneath their cabin roof. Ezekiel Pratt, who had tried to walk to the church on the 3rd day and whose body was not found until spring. Sarah Coleman, 81 years old, her heart simply stopping in the cold. The list went on. Each name a wound in the community's memory. Each death a reminder of what the mountains could do when they chose to remind humans of their smallness. Rosalind Seller had saved 40 lives. 40 people who would have died in collapsed buildings or frozen bedrooms or exhausted food supplies. 40 people who had eaten her preserved vegetables and her smoked venison, and who had slept on platforms she had built with her own hands. The general store, with all its advertised goods and premium prices, had saved no one. Its owner had fled to the Gopher hole he had mocked, carrying his children through chest-deep snow, and he had said nothing for 9 days while the woman he had ridiculed fed his family. If you would like to hear other stories of hardship overcome and wisdom shared, there's a button below that says subscribe. Pressing it costs nothing and ensures you will not miss the tales to come. The snow began to settle and compact in early December, and the people of Quartz Hill started the grim work of rebuilding. Rosalind's cellar gradually emptied as families returned to whatever remained of their homes, carrying with them jars of preserved food she insisted they take, and knowledge she had pressed into their minds like seeds into soil. Some would grow, some would wither, but all had been planted, and that was what mattered. The gathering came in December on the 23rd day of the month, 2 days before Christmas. The half-rebuilt church still lacked a roof over its eastern section, and snow drifted through the gaps in the temporary canvas that covered the damage. But the congregation that assembled that morning was larger than any that had gathered since the silver gave out. Every survivor who could walk had come. They sat in pews that still bore watermarks from the storm, wrapped in blankets and coats against the cold that seeped through the walls, and they faced the front of the church where a single chair had been placed for Rosalind Ironwood. She had not asked to sit there. She had not asked for any of this. But when the Reverend Morrison had come to her cellar 3 days prior and explained what the community wished to do, she had not refused. Her grandmother had taught her that confession was medicine for the soul, and that those who needed to confess should be given space to do so. Caleb Holbrook stood first. He rose from the front pew where he sat with Martha and their 3 children, and his legs shook so badly that for a moment it seemed he might fall. His face was thinner than it had been before the storm, the comfortable prosperity that had padded his cheeks now stripped away by 9 days of rationed food and the certain knowledge of his own failure. He walked to the front of the church and turned to face the congregation, and when he spoke, his voice cracked on the first word and did not recover. I called her the jar lady. He had to stop and swallow before he could continue. I stood behind my counter and I told anyone who would listen that she was building a tomb for her dead husband's ghost to live in. I said no woman needs that much food unless she is planning to eat herself into the grave. I said her cellar was a gopher hole, fit only for a creature too stupid to know when winter was coming. I made those words into a joke, and I laughed at that joke, and I taught this town to laugh at it with me. He stopped. His hands were trembling at his sides, and tears ran freely down his cheeks, leaving tracks in the grime that still clung to his skin despite 2 weeks of relative safety. The storm came. My store fell. Everything I had built, everything I had invested, everything I had planned to sell to this community at prices I set because I was the only supplier within 30 miles, all of it was taken by the wind. I stood in the wreckage of my life and I watched it disappear under the snow, and I knew that my children would starve because I had been too proud to prepare. I had been too proud to listen to the woman I called the jar lady. His voice broke entirely on the next words. I went to her cellar. I took my wife and my children and I walked through snow that reached my chest, and I went to the gopher hole I had mocked, and I begged her to let us in. She did not mock me. She did not remind me of what I had said. She simply opened the door and welcomed my children, and fed them from the very shelves I had laughed about. For 9 days, Rosalind Ironwood kept my family alive with food she had preserved while I was making jokes at her expense. I do not deserve her forgiveness. I know that. But I am standing here before God and this community to say that I was wrong, and cruel, and blind, and I am asking for the forgiveness I do not deserve. He stood there shaking, tears dripping from his chin onto the wooden floor of the church, and he could not look at Rosalind. He could only stare at his own feet and wait. Martha Holbrook stood next. She walked to stand beside her husband, and she too faced the congregation rather than Rosalind, as though confession required witnesses more than it required the presence of the wronged. I organized the quilting circle to exclude her. Her voice was steadier than her husband's, but her hands gripped each other so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. I told the women of this church that Rosalind Ironwood was strange, that she was not one of us, that her ways were foreign and her preparations were excessive, and we should not associate ourselves with someone so clearly touched by grief madness. I made sure she had no community. I made sure she was alone. And when the storm came, I discovered what it truly meant to be alone, trapped in my home with my children crying from hunger and my husband staring at the walls with dead eyes because everything he had built was gone. She saved us anyway. She took us into the shelter I had mocked, and she fed us from the provisions I had dismissed as madness, and she never once reminded me that I had made her an outcast. I'm asking for her forgiveness because I cannot live with what I did, if I do not at least ask. If you're finding meaning in this tale, the like button tells others that the story is worth their time. A small action, but the algorithm listens to such small actions. The third to stand was a man named Horace Wheeler, a mine foreman from the Silver days who had stayed on when the ore gave out because he had nowhere else to go. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and rough-handed, and he had been among those who laughed loudest when Caleb coined the term gopher hole. I threw a rock at her wagon once, he said. Not the Hendricks boy, though he did it too. I threw a rock because I was drunk, and because my friends were watching, and because it seemed funny at the time. The rock cracked one of her jars, and she did not even turn around. She just kept driving, and I laughed, and my friends laughed, and we told the story in the saloon for weeks afterward. He paused, and his jaw worked as though he were chewing on something bitter. I lost 3 toes to frostbite during the storm. I would have lost my life if she had not sent a rescue party to dig me out of the collapsed boarding house on the 8th day. She sent men to save me. Men I had taught to laugh at her. She sent them anyway. I am asking her forgiveness because I was a coward who hid my cruelty behind laughter, and she was brave enough to save a coward. The fourth confessor was Elizabeth Garrett, the widow who had walked through chest-deep snow carrying her surviving infant. She stood with difficulty, still weak from her ordeal, and the congregation fell utterly silent as she made her way to the front. "I never mocked her openly," Elizabeth said, "but I laughed when others did. I smiled when Caleb called her the jar lady. I did not defend her when Martha excluded her from the circle. My silence was its own kind of cruelty, and I told myself it was not my responsibility to speak for a woman I barely knew. Then my twins died. She had to stop as grief seized her throat. My beautiful children, my son and my daughter, crushed beneath the roof of our home while I held them and begged God to stop the beam from falling. I walked to her cellar because I had nowhere else to go. I thought she would turn me away. I thought she would remind me of my silence and send me back into the snow to die. Instead, she held me while I wept. She fed my baby from her stores. She said she was sorry that my children had died, and I could hear in her voice that she meant it, that she truly grieved for children she had never met. I'm asking her forgiveness because I should have spoken when others mocked her, and my silence cost me the right to ask. But I am asking anyway, because I cannot carry this weight forever." The fifth and final confessor was Reverend Morrison himself. He rose from his seat near the altar and walked to join the others, and the congregation stirred with surprise, for no one had expected the minister to count himself among those who had wronged the widow. "I preached a sermon last September," he said, "about the dangers of worldly attachment. I used Rosalind Ironwood's cellar as an example. I said that those who stored up treasures on earth showed a lack of faith in God's providence. I said that true Christians trusted in the Lord to provide, and that excessive preparation revealed excessive fear, and that fear was the opposite of faith." He stopped, and when he continued, his voice was thick with shame. I was wrong. I dressed my mockery in Scripture, and that made it worse, not better. I told this congregation that her preparations were sinful, and they believed me because I spoke from this pulpit. When the storm came, I hid in the church basement with nothing but a single loaf of bread and a jar of water, trusting in the providence I had preached about. By the 6th day, I was praying for death. By the 7th day, I crawled to her cellar on my hands and knees because my legs would not carry me. She fed me. She did not ask if I had learned anything about faith and fear and the difference between them. She simply fed me. I am asking her forgiveness because I used God's word as a weapon against a woman who was only trying to survive, and that is a sin I will carry to my grave whether she forgives me or not. The church fell silent. 5 people stood at the front, their confessions given, their tears shed, their shame laid bare before the community. And Rosalind Ironwood sat in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face as still and calm as the surface of a mountain lake on a windless day. She rose slowly. She walked to the front of the church, and she stood facing not the confessors but the congregation, because what she had to say was meant for everyone. My grandmother used to say that mockery is just fear wearing a mask. Her voice was soft, but in the silence of the church, it carried to every ear. She learned that in Wales, in the valleys where she grew up, where the iron furnaces went cold and the wages stopped and the bodies piled in the chapel yards. She watched her neighbors mock the women who preserved food when times were good, calling them fearful and faithless and strange. And then she watched those same neighbors come to those women's doors when the hunger came, begging for what they had ridiculed. She survived because she ignored the mockery. She preserved anyway. And when the hungry time came, she fed not just herself, but 3 orphaned nieces whose parents had died of fever in the second winter. Rosalind paused and looked at the 5 confessors who stood before her. She told me something else, too. She said that forgiveness was not something you could ask for like a cup of sugar. She said it was not a transaction where you confessed and received absolution and went on your way with a clear conscience. She said forgiveness was a process, not a moment, and that the person who did the wrong had to earn it through changed behavior, not just through words spoken in a church. The confessors did not move. The congregation did not breathe. I will not say that I forgive you. Rosalind's voice was steady, but there was something in it that might have been sorrow, or might have been pity. Not because I wish to punish you, not because I hold your mockery against you, but because forgiveness is not mine to give for free. You called me the jar lady. You called my cellar a gopher hole. You excluded me from your community and threw rocks at my wagon and preached sermons about my lack of faith. Those words and actions had consequences. They taught this town that preparation was foolish. They taught this town that practical wisdom was something to ridicule. And 23 people died because this town was not prepared for what was coming. She let that sink in. Let the weight of it settle on every shoulder in the church. I do not blame you for those deaths. The storm killed them, not your words. But I want you to understand that mockery has consequences you cannot foresee. When you ridiculed my preparations, you were not just hurting me. You were telling everyone in this town that they should not prepare either. You were making safety into a joke. And now, 23 families are grieving because this town was not ready for what came. For those who have stayed with this story to its heart, sharing it with others who might need to hear its message would honor the grandmother whose wisdom made it possible. She turned to face the congregation directly, and her voice grew stronger. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. That is what my grandmother did. That is what I will do. When spring comes, I will show you how to dig a cellar that will hold its temperature year-round. I will teach you how to preserve meat so it lasts for months. I will explain the signs that the animals show us when they know something is coming. I will give you everything my grandmother gave me. Because knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted, and because the next storm is always coming, whether we prepare for it or not. She looked at Caleb Holbrook, who had not raised his eyes from the floor. You asked for my forgiveness. I am offering you something better. I am offering you the chance to learn what I know, to prepare as I prepared, to become the kind of person who will never again need to beg shelter from a neighbor you mocked. Take that offer. Take it and use it, and build something better than what you had before. And if you do that, if you truly do that, then perhaps one day forgiveness will be something you have earned rather than something you have simply requested. She sat down. No one spoke. No one moved. The church remained frozen in that moment. 5 confessors standing with tears on their faces, and a community behind them grappling with truths they had never wanted to hear. Then, slowly, the congregation began to rise, and they filed out into the December cold, and they carried with them the memory of what had been said. 43 years later, on a September morning when the aspens were just beginning to turn gold, Rosalind Ironwood died in her bed at the age of 77. The doctor who attended her said her heart simply stopped, the same way her grandmother's heart had stopped all those years ago in Wales. She died with a jar of preserved peaches on her nightstand, the last batch she had put up that summer, the glass glowing amber in the morning light. By then, over 200 root cellars had been built throughout the Colorado mountains using her methods. Her students had taught their own students, who had taught theirs, and the knowledge had spread like water flowing downhill, finding every crack and crevice where it might be useful. The phrase jarring like an ironwood had entered the local vocabulary, a piece of slang that meant preparing thoroughly, completely, with nothing left to chance. Young mothers said it to their daughters when they taught them to preserve the summer harvest. Old men said it to their sons when they showed them how to read the signs of coming storms. What had begun as mockery had transformed into reverence, and the woman who had been called the jar lady was remembered as the teacher who had saved a town. Caleb Holbrook became her most devoted student. After that December gathering in the church, he had come to her cellar 3 times a week throughout the winter, learning everything she would teach him. He rebuilt his general store with a root cellar beneath it, stocked according to her methods, and he never again sold preparations he had not tested himself. When he died in 1912, his son continued the tradition, and his grandson after that, and the Holbrook General Store became known throughout the region as the place where you could buy provisions that would last through anything the mountains could throw at you. Whisper lived for another 8 years after the Great Storm, dying in the spring of 1895 at the considerable age of 23. Rosalind buried her on the property, in a spot where the wildflowers grew thick in summer, and she marked the grave with a stone carved by her own hands. Good horse, the stone read. Good friend. True heart. She visited that grave every Sunday until her own death, bringing a handful of oats and speaking softly about the week's events, about the students who had come, about the cellars that were being built, about the life that had grown from preparation and perseverance. The cellar still stands. It is carved into the same north-facing slope where Rosalind dug it more than a century and a quarter ago, and the stone walls she fitted together without mortar still hold their shape. The temperature inside still holds steady at 42 degrees. The ventilation system still works, air flowing through salvaged stovepipe that was old when Victoria was queen. Tourists come to see it now, guided by rangers from the State Historical Society, and they marvel at the craftsmanship and the foresight and the sheer stubbornness of a widow who dug into a mountainside because her grandmother told her it would save lives. Above the entrance, carved into a slab of native granite, an inscription faces east toward Wales, toward the valley where Bronwyn Perry first learned that survival was an inheritance. The mountains told me. I told you. Now we both know. The words have weathered but not faded, protected by the overhang that Rosalind built to shelter the entrance from rain and snow. Visitors often stop to photograph them, asking the rangers what they mean, and the rangers tell the story of a Welsh grandmother who survived the hungry 40s and passed her knowledge to a granddaughter who carried it across an ocean and a continent to a mountainside in Colorado. Bronwyn Perry would have understood that inscription perfectly. She would have recognized the impulse behind it, the need to declare that knowledge is not lost when the one who holds it dies, that survival is a chain stretching from grandmother to granddaughter to the students who came after. She would have been proud. The cellar still stands, and the inscription still faces east, and somewhere in the high country, the elk still move down from the peaks when they sense something coming, their ancient wisdom unchanged by all the years that have passed since a widow watched them flee and understood what they were telling her.